Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for letting me know that. We'll go to our learning objective slide. And very briefly, it's telling me I have a little note that the meeting is being recorded. So I'm going to just continue. So today what we hope to do is to increase everybody's confidence that given an incident in which they have to respond to teen dating violence, they can do it in a trauma-informed way and in a confident way, because these are not easy. So this is not easy subject matter. We want to increase everybody's knowledge of their role in terms of disclosures of teen dating violence. So this presentation was originally developed for teachers, and I think it's appropriate for anyone who's working with youth, but your roles may be different, your level of expertise may be different, and that will come into play. And of course, PREVNet is embarking on a project where we're figuring out the legislative context for different territories and provinces. What are, if you're a teacher, if you're a youth worker, if you work at an agency, what is your duty to report? What are the limits of confidentiality? So we're going to get into that as well. So next slide, please. Thinking about dating violence, it's a very broad area. It's also called, as you know, adolescent dating violence or intimate partner violence among adolescents, etc. But we're really talking about 4 different vehicles or modes of teen dating violence: physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological, and technology assisted. So just that's to refresh everybody's kind of mindset. These are the different kinds of violence that we'll be discussing today. Next slide, please. So again, just to sort of set the context, this slide shows you the most recent Canadian statistics from the 2017 to 18 school year HBSC data. So this is nationally representative data, including over 3,000, almost 4,000 students in grade 9 and 10 who reported dating experience in the last year. And we can see that there is over 10% of students report having been victimized in a teen dating relationship. Well over a quarter have experienced being victimized in a psychological or emotional way, and 17.5% in terms of cyber technology, electronic technology. And interestingly, we always see, it's not unusual to see a greater proportion of students reporting having been victimized as opposed to having perpetrated violence. And that probably comes down to their own understanding and definitions of the various behaviors. It's also interesting to note that in terms of whether those who did report having perpetrated any kind of dating violence, 82.6% of those people said it was in the context of a mutually violent, conflictual interaction. So it wasn't just them, it was they were on the receiving end as well as on the perpetrating end. So next slide, please. So actually, here we are. It's interesting to see what were the risk factors. And this will, I don't think, come as a surprise to anybody in the audience, but just briefly to review those who reported victimization, which of course is more people report victimization. They tended to be older. They tended to report a female or non-binary gender identity. They lived in single parent, more likely to live in single parent households, and report food insecurity and lower family affluence. And it's quite similar, as you can see, for students who reported perpetrating. So the correlates really show you, and that leads us to the next slide. The correlates of teen dating violence, not just in Canadian data, but in international data, really points to the structural inequities and the social determinants of health. And when we get into what are the root causes of violence, and we really have to keep this wider perspective. The root causes of violence really have to do with poverty, with inequity, with oppression. And so even when we're responding, we have to keep this kind of wider knowledge in the back of our mind, because even when we are responding to incidents and to individual students, we have to have that sort of systemic and structural foundation so that we can teach students, and we should teach students and young people to know what their rights are and to be assertive, etc. But at the same time, we don't want to inadvertently communicate in any way that will be interpreted by students as they don't get it and they're blaming the victim. So moving on to the next slide, this whole thing is about how do adults respond? What is the optimal way of responding? However, how do adults even know to respond? So really, as we'll see, it's not that easy, because often, of course, it is hidden and there are lots of barriers to disclosure. So occasionally teens who are directly involved might seek support from an adult, from somebody like you. You might be in a position where you witness an event, and the new word is actioner rather than bystander, because we hope adults who have had training and who are sensitive to the issue and who want to promote well-being and mental health among young people would step in and get involved when they witness something. And also, adults will often become aware of a situation because they're told by not necessarily the students involved or the young people involved, but by their peers. So moving on to the next slide. There are lots and lots of there's lots of research. Well, no, actually, there's not so much research about help seeking for teen dating violence behaviors among young people. So the research varies depending on the population that was studied, but overall, it's often reported that as many as a quarter of students endure a teen dating violence relationship and don't tell anyone. Informal sources are the most common. So students will most often tell their friends and sometimes tell their parents or other adults in their life, like extended family members. In terms of formal support, such as people who work in the area, mental health supports, and teachers and school staff, it varies, but as you can see, it's not a great deal of people who would really disclose, and there's lots of barriers. But there are a few things that we know, which I think is really important. School climate and the overall perceptions that students have of how helpful students are, how committed the school is to issues of social justice and teen dating violence prevention. All of these things make a difference. And students are more likely to disclose to adults in a school in which there is that kind of very positive climate. Overall, females tend to make disclosures more often than males, or reach out for help more often than males. And interestingly, students really are more likely to reach out for help if it's a case of physical or sexual violence, as opposed to psychological and emotional violence or cyber dating violence. Although we should keep in mind that sometimes violence in relationships is progressive, and it would be good to, when we're teaching students and teaching young people about teen dating violence, that they see that these seemingly less serious forms may actually have really traumatic impacts, number one, and number two, may progress. And it might be easier for many reasons in terms of confidentiality, which we'll get into. It might be much easier to intervene in an effective and positive way if an intervener has an opportunity to find out about what's going on early in the relationship rather than when things have become extremely serious. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that there are lots and lots of barriers to for teens and adolescents who would experience that would prevent them or make them extremely hesitant to disclose to formal sources. So first of all, the idea that their privacy, they are very worried about confidentiality and what reporting would entail and getting involved with systems that they don't trust. On a personal level, there's a sense of responsibility very often, guilt, embarrassment, shame, feeling that they are to blame. So it makes it really hard to talk about these issues. There often, as I said, there's a lack of trust in those people who are in a position to help. And as well, they may fear their partner's response, that their partner may retaliate or feel very let down, or more significantly, they may fear harmful consequences that their partner would have to endure as a result of their disclosure. So now we're moving on to the next slide. We're going to talk about trauma. So trauma is any kind of overwhelming experience that has the potential to do psychological damage in the moment because it is experienced as overwhelming and horrid, horrible, awful, and that the long-term consequences are often going to be very significant in the person's life. So, you know, people can define trauma by its source, its severity, its frequency, and it's important to remember that everybody defines trauma differently. So moving on to the next slide. When we think about trauma and violence informed care, this is another step. So we're talking about trauma and violence informed care refers to trauma that is linked to experiencing or perpetrating violence. And it expands the concept of trauma-informed care to acknowledge that broader structural conditions that impact a person's well-being. The first barrier, the thing that students and young people are so concerned about when it comes to disclosing and help seeking is the confidentiality issues, as I've noted. So we feel that it's really, really important that every adult who's working with young people, and particularly in the area of teen dating violence, but really I would say any adult working with young people, should be aware of what the limits of confidentiality are for them, depending on their role and where they work. And it's very important at the beginning of any disclosure or any interaction about dating violence that you initiate that the young people that you're working with get it. They know that there are some things that you will be obligated to make a report. And we'll talk about that more specifically in a little while. But the crucial message to communicate is that I am here for you and we'll make decisions together about how I report. You need to know, if I'm concerned about your safety, then I have an ethical obligation to keep you safe by making a report. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be truthful and out front about it. So it gives the teen or the young person the opportunity to decide whether to confide in you and how much to confide in you. It's also important that often the concerns of young people have to do with gossip. They don't want to think that if they tell, let's say, a librarian in a secondary school, that all of the staff in the staff room will be talking about their issue. So it's not just their concerns about where the reporting goes to. There are concerns about being the center of attention in an unhealthy way. And so you can reassure that within the confines of confidentiality and obligatory reporting, that you will not, that you will be as respectful as possible and respect young people's privacy. And when we make decisions about what are our obligations, it can be very tough. The idea is that we have to consider the risk of harm to the individual and what protection they need versus risking their trust and possibly making things worse by making a report. So moving on to the next slide about the adult response. Again, it's this idea of how can we be mindful about our duty to report and still feel that we can have a productive and helpful conversation with a young person. I think the idea is the imperative that you have beforehand, and we'll talk about that, to know what your limits are of confidentiality, to know what your legal and ethical obligations are, and to be able to balance that. A trauma and violence informed school policy will enable you, or organizational policy will enable you to have these kinds of conversations with your colleagues well in advance so that you're prepared when you're actually talking to a student about violence in a relationship. Moving on to the next slide. When we think about what do we say, what are the kinds of words that we say, to be trauma informed when we're talking to young people is to be supportive and validating, to really communicate that we understand that they did the best they could in the circumstances they found themselves and that they are not to blame. So the statements that are supportive are things like, I'm so thankful that you're willing to talk about this. I'm so impressed by the courage you have shown to bring this up. It sounds like you've tried really hard to let your partner know that this is not okay. I can see you've done everything you could to stay safe. These kinds of relationship behaviors are not unusual. They're not okay, and we can deal with them, but they're not so unusual. That idea of normalizing. And most importantly, to convey the message, it's not your fault. You are not responsible for your partner's behavior. And these are the kinds of things that we want to communicate. On the other hand, some of the things we wouldn't want to say is things like, how could you put up with this? Why did you take this long to tell someone? Or anything else that can be construed as victim blaming. Remembering that the people that we're talking to have endured a very difficult experience, and it is so difficult for them to talk. They may be feeling a great deal of shame, and so it won't take much for them to feel blamed. Also, we have to be aware of where we stand and how we're perceived in relationship to how they are feeling. And it's most important that we convey a great sense of respect and working forward, working collaboratively with them. And saying something like, oh, well, we should connect you with the school counselor immediately, those kinds of things that moving right into process without developing trust and developing explanation is going to make the person feel very bad, that you're just worried about following procedure and policy rather than truly and genuinely being helpful. And we wouldn't, sometimes we might inadvertently say things that blame a culture and say, well, maybe it's normal among your partner's culture to behave this way. Things like that are judgmental, structurally violent, and would absolutely stop you as being able to be helpful for that person. So again, moving on to the next slide, there is some research that really shows us that the kinds of statements that students themselves have said were the most helpful were statements that deal with their own rights as human beings. So they do not have the right to treat you like that, or to hit you, or to control you, or you should be free to go where you want without being monitored. Those are kinds of statements that students have reported are helpful. And again, the idea that the abuse that you're experiencing is not your fault. Even, I mean, the majority, as I said earlier, students most often report that the violent or aggressive acts take place in a sort of mutual context. So both members of the relationship often feel quite guilty and responsible, but it's a dynamic, and letting them realize they are young. They are very young people experiencing a depth and a passion of feelings that they've never experienced before. And they have their ability to regulate their emotions and regulate their behavior are developing, and really taking a non-judgmental, this is not your fault stance is essential. Moving on to the next slide. When we think of, from an organizational point of view, whether it's in a school setting or an agency or a program that delivers services to young people, it's incredibly important to overall have a context of an organizational culture that recognizes the impacts of trauma and violence in people's lives, and recognizes that how common it is, and recognize how long-term the effects can be. It's a huge principle to be very intentional about creating safety and fostering trust among your colleagues and young people, and facilitating opportunities for choice, collaboration, and connection, so that when incident, when a problematic relationship comes to your attention, the process will be collaborative, and it will be connected and mutually respectful to enable these young people to make decisions that are, and choices that will promote their well-being. And to do that, of course, we always want to build on the strength and skills of the young people with whom we're working. Next slide. So we want to create safety and foster trust. That is the big thing. Traumatic experiences can involve feelings of loss of control or power. So part of creating safety is giving control and power back to the student. As much as we want to create opportunities for students experiencing teen dating violence to trust teachers and to trust others who are working with them, we need to realize that it might take students time, and they might never fully trust us for reasons outside of our control, and that's okay, because it needs to be about the student. And the comfort and safety of staff is important too. It's very difficult We may have our own experiences of trauma. Experience vicarious trauma and burnout through working in this area with children and youth. So safety and trust are important on both sides. Moving on to the next slide. When we're working with young people who are involved in a relationship in which there's some kind of dating violence happening, we have to realize that it is not a question of somebody will come to us and say, I'm in an unhealthy relationship and I'm going to break up. It doesn't work that way. And we have to realize that hopefully we have created a knowledge base and a commitment and a sense of empowerment that young people know that they're entitled to safe and healthy relationships. And that's what they should aspire to. But on the other hand, there are many reasons that it will be very difficult for them to decide to make a decision, whether to try and change the relationship, whether to end the relationship. And ending the relationship might entail even greater risk of harm. So it's like they're balancing the love they feel for their partner and the loyalty, their reputation, their doubt, is it my fault? Should I get someone involved? The fear of what will happen if I report this to an adult, the blame, the guilt, the embarrassment. So it's a very difficult, young people will be feeling a lot of emotions. Many of them will be conflicting, and helping them sort out their feelings is how we can be helpful, not telling them, of course, what to do. Moving on to the next slide, it's really important that when we're finding out about situations, we have to be thinking about the student who's perpetuating the violence. This student will also need help and support. And there may be conflicts, there may be difficulties. We often think of the victim needing help, but just as important, these are young people, as I said, navigating romantic and intimate sexual relationships without very little life experience, experiencing very strong and powerful emotions, having other areas in their life that have perhaps increased their risk for using violence as a means of conflict resolution, using violence in intimate relationships. So it's not, to be an actionist means that we're going to be committed to helping students who are using violence, students who are experiencing violence, and also students witnessing or suspecting that there's violence going on. It would be very important, for example, for adults to create a culture in which a friend might come to talk to you, excuse me, because the friend is concerned for what they see is happening in the peer group. So moving on to the next slide. In order to be to do this work, there's a lot of things that you really need to know. And it's hard sometimes to know what you need to know. So first of all, what is the provincial or territorial legislation regarding safe schools and school violence prevention that govern your actions that are important? If you work in a school, what is the board policy and your individual school policy? And most schools don't have teen dating violence policy because it's a relatively new area, but we know it's a very important area. And it often seems to grow out of what we know about bullying and bullying prevention. But it's different than bullying. It has a lot of similar behaviors, like when we think about it in, the actual bullying behaviors, teen dating violence is that, but it's in the context of a romantic relationship. We also have to think about the limits of our professional roles. As a teacher, your role is to stay connected with the student. Teachers are in a unique position in which they are able to monitor students on a daily basis. As a teacher, you need to fulfill the mandatory reporting requirements and, when necessary, make a referral to an agency or an individual who has expertise in teen dating violence and mental health support for adolescents. So it's really important for school personnel to be very familiar with their local landscape of agencies that provide and providers who work with teen dating violence, so that when you're talking to a student, whether you just observe something and you're following up, whether someone's come to you and disclosed, that you have this knowledge that you're part of it, of a community of helpers, and you don't have to feel that it's your burden individually. Moving on to the next slide. So what can we say about the legislative landscape? And it's similar in Canada to the United States. I've been doing a lot of reading, and it's very, here are the main points. There's really, no one's really enacted teen dating violence prevention legislation. So what's, in terms of our federal law, federal protections against youth dating violence could be found in the Criminal Code and the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So that outlines like the very serious, egregious kind of violence incidents that become that have to be reported to the justice system. But in each province and territory, there are, again, there's no formal legislation on youth dating violence, but rights and responsibilities related to this topic can be found in safe school legislation, which is across Canada, and Family Service Youth Protection Acts. And right now, PREVNet is currently working on summaries done by law students for each province and territory. And this will be on our website. So if people are familiar with the PREVNet website, you can click on provinces and territories to find out what the bullying prevention legislation is all about. Similarly, you'll be able to find out legislation that pertains specifically to teen dating violence. So moving on to the next slide. So although teen dating violence is not specifically mentioned as a term, or adolescent dating violence, there's usually bullying behaviors are defined to include harassment, stalking, cyberbullying, those kind, all of those behaviors, specific behaviors, are often defined, and they are met in teachers and other school staff are obligated to report these behaviors to school principals. And also, in other places, behaviors worthy of suspension, which again would involve very, very serious behaviors. And there's also family service and child and youth protection legislation across Canada that deal with the duty to report, so that if a person has a reasonable ground to suspect that a young person is being or is at risk of being physically abused, sexually abused, or subject to physical harm, and is suffering emotional harm, then and this is an interesting point, and the child's caretaker is unable or to protect the young person, or unwilling to protect the young person. So then we have to think about parent involvement, and when it would not be our duty to make a a children's aid kind of report, but it would probably be our duty to report to parents. But there are some cases in which it would be very devastating and eroding of the trust the young person has in us to talk to the youth's parents. So there's a lot of individual case by case, very difficult decision making that may have to occur. So what we sort of frontline people want to be able to do is to make warm referrals. That means getting to know, like I said, agencies and service providers in your community, so that it would be ideal if a person comes and talks to you and you could say, well, I know a program for young men who are dealing with, who are trying to reduce aggression in their intimate relationships. So that would you like me to call this person with you or for you? And then they'll be expecting your call. So this idea of making connections, we have to have the knowledge of where to connect these young people. And then it's really putting as much as you can within the limits of what you're mandated that you must do to let the student be in the driver's seat and make the decisions. If possible, give them choices and let them do the decision making. And ask them what are their goals and what is most helpful for them. And it would be great if you had sort of a menu of potential resources in advance. So it sort of tells the young people that we have programs for this, we have services, and we have help for this because we get it. We know that it happens, and we are here to help you navigate the system so that you could get through this difficult time. So in breaking down the principles of trauma and violence informed care, is how important it is to facilitate opportunities for choice, collaboration, and connection. Offering choice whenever it is at all possible. Next slide is we want to always build on the students' strengths and skills. And that's why having positive, caring, and mutually respectful relationships with students is so important, so that when difficulties arise, we know them and we're aware of what strengths they have to cope and what will help them, and what how they can manage their stress using their strengths and their interests. Moving on to the next slide. When we think about having a conversation, a difficult conversation, because the student or the young person has come to us or we've come to them, we want to check in with ourselves. How are we feeling? What are our biases? What are our assumptions? Are we overwhelmed that we have so much work and now this is going to open up a whole huge amount of more work? So being able to really be honest in the moment with ourselves and know where we are feeling will enable us to regulate and modulate so that we can respond to the young person in a really affirming, trauma-informed, a respectful way. And then we can clarify. The student or the young person will be having a lot of very different and powerful thoughts and feelings. Our job is just to be a good listener and to clarify what they're saying, answer their questions, and continue to follow up. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over to the follow-up slide. it's important that we don't just have this conversation and think our work is done. It is incredibly important to follow up with them over the coming days and weeks, perhaps months. Ask the student how they prefer to follow up, and find a confidential time and space to check in that meets with their needs. So that follow-up is not perceived as intrusive by the young people or an invasion of their privacy, but is something that is pre-planned. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of organizational culture, it is so important that with your colleagues, you have these conversations about your values and your beliefs and your practices, your internal policies. What needs to be reported to the principal? What needs to be, how do we make decisions? How do we hold this burden? And so this has to be, these big questions can best be dealt with in a place that has a violence-informed, trauma-informed culture in which there is a lot of collaboration between staff, a lot of conversation, and policy becomes a living and breathing kind of thing. Moving on to the next slide, there, of course, are barriers to organizational change that would make this difficult: limited time, lack of buy-in from leadership, limited organizational understanding of teen dating violence, and lack of a shared vision for change and organizational readiness. So this is where advocacy comes in, and training for everybody involved. It's essential in order to create that kind of climate in which adults have the tools and the backup that they need to respond in really helpful ways. So what can schools do about their organizational culture? Key things, like I said, staff training and intentionally creating more inclusive spaces for marginalized groups at school. Developing a confidentiality policy as it relates to teen dating violence, and developing a dating violence policy and procedure. So finally, I'm ready to answer questions, but it's really important as we check out is to think about self-care and what we can do to enjoy sunshine, feel good, and feel that we are ready to be agents of change and genuine help for young people.
Thanks, Joe. That was great, and really appreciate your thoughtful insights and thoughts about this. I'm now going to open up the floor for any questions. I'm also trying to put the references in that were asked for. So do we have any questions? If people want to raise their hand, we can, I'll just go back into chat and see. Any questions?
Oh, I see a note, people are in webinar mode, can't raise their hand.
Oh. They can't raise their hand. Okay, here we go. I think I see one. So you stated that the 2017 HBSC study found 17.5% identified falling under the category of cyber abuse. I know 2021 US found 28% of schools. Should the digital relationship abuse, now formal, be a component to the domestic abuse cycle?
Wendy, what do you think? Because since you're so familiar with that data.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we should be adding it. I think especially during COVID, we know that lots of adolescents are now, the increase in sexting is like, for example, is fourfold. So they're connecting and interacting with their partners online. So we need to be more inclusive in our definition.
And we know, I mean, we know how the internet technology enables a lot of unhealthy relationship behaviors, harassing, controlling somebody's movements, checking in on them. I think it's an incredibly important experience thing.
Yeah, I agree. Any other? Darren agrees with our thoughts. I don't know if you have questions, if you want to put them in. I don't know if you still can't raise your hand, or if you want to put them in the chat box, we can catch them. Oh, okay. We're adding some of those references that Lee was looking for. There's more, Lee, but there's some that we've got in there for you. Well, if there are no more questions, do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share or reflections, Joe?
Well, I'd love to hear from people, because I think that having these conversations and the role that we can play can be so pivotal. I mean, they say that for many people who have experienced trauma, relationship trauma, in an intimate partner relationship, the disclosure was more traumatizing than actually what happened. So we are the community. We're the people that young people will disclose to. And I wonder how other people are feeling about this and have anything that they want to share.
I see there's some questions that popped up, Joe, before that. Can I throw those in the mix too?
Sure, sure.
What kind of legal jeopardy do teachers face if they don't report when teen in need of protection, given in-parent loci? Given that they're the parent, the guardians at school.
Right. Well, I think that I think like in Ontario, there's a fine of $600 to $700, but really, I don't know. I don't feel like this is my area of expertise. But I really think that I understand that teachers could feel quite nervous about what their responsibilities are and what negative outcomes might befall them if they don't do it exactly right. And that's why I think a collaborative, collegial conversations have to happen within every school so that teachers don't feel like they're acting alone, that there's other people they can consult with.
Yeah, I think it's really murky. I think that's the problem. The problem is that, you know, if we compare it to bullying, we have very clear definitions in policy. We have very clear actions that are required. The problem with teen dating violence is that it's not specifically named. And so it's subsumed under different policies like peer-to-peer aggression and how a school would respond to that peer-to-peer aggression. So I think there is a real legislative void that does need to be addressed to give people more information. So just follow up with that. Where do you suggest a school start in clarifying how adults will respond to disclosure of dating violence?
I would suggest that that you consult our prep, you know, as soon as it's ready for each province and territory, start with what the legal framework is, as inadequate and as it may be, and then talk among open and honest conversations among you with your school principal. Maybe have some kind of legal representative from the board in which your school is part of, and really say, okay, well, in this case, we would notify the parents if it was kind of like this. But it's got to be kind of like, I don't know that you could be so specific because every case is different, but to get some principles. If there is, you're aware of acts that are actually putting a young person at imminent risk of psychological or physical harm, what are we going to do? Who are we going to call? We will, when do we contact parents? Like to try and make it a living document, make your policy kind of living and breathing. So as you gain different experiences, as different things occur in your school community, you can learn and grow from them.
Yeah, I think you're right. It starts, you have to start with striking that committee and getting the different expertise in it. That will help it. Okay. Thank you. Just making sure I've got all the questions. I find that many teachers are not reporting given the belief, what if I'm wrong?
So again, I think it comes from that. Well, two thoughts occur to me. The idea that if you have a reasonable ground to be suspect somebody is at risk of harm, and it's not malevolent, you're not trying to get someone in trouble, like you're really concerned, then I don't think anyone would ever be faulted. I mean, that's the kind of principle of the law for talking to the school principal or talking to the parents. However, at the same time, teachers are afraid of being wrong, but they're in a very privileged position in terms of how much they get to observe students and they get to pick up on things. Hopefully, teachers will feel emboldened to have a very tentative, respectful conversation with a student if they've seen something that aroused their suspicions. The student might say, no, everything's fine, which would not be surprising. And then the response from the teacher should be, well, I'm here if you ever change your mind, because it's often a process. I'm here and you can come and talk to me and be specific if you can. Like, I'm always at my desk at 3:30 on Wednesdays. That would be a good time to come and talk to me, and to sort of maintain lots of observation and gather more data. So again, it's really hard to say exactly what to do, but I think the principle is that trust your gut. If you do see something that makes you feel uncomfortable and worried and concerned, if you can, broach the topic in a really gentle, non-intrusive, and a respectful, trauma-informed way with the student, and keep it up, create a process, create a dialogue. It's unlikely that you would say, is something going wrong? I see that your partner is waiting for you after every class. I see that the quality of your work is deteriorating. I see that you're late in assignments. That's unusual for you. I wouldn't necessarily expect a student to say, yes, you're right, here's my story, but the student, you open a door and you hope that the student will be able to walk through that door.
Yeah, great answer. Very thoughtful, Jo. Last call for questions in the chat box, apparently. Can you speak more about reporting to parents and navigating that decision-making with the young person?
Yes, so from my experience, parents can be a really good source of help, but I would really speak to the student and try and get not just about this dating relationship specifically, but an overall sense of what their relationship with their parents are like. Some students will vehemently worry that any kind of intervention will involve their parents because dating might be forbidden. Their parents might not know about their sexual orientation and who their partner is. They might be worried about their parents who are experiencing other stressors and they don't want to add to their parents' burden. So I would have a very probing, I guess, conversation with the student to find out what their concerns are about involving their parents. But if their concerns are not sufficient to make you decide, no, this student is old enough and I'm going to get them support bypassing their parents, I think that would be a rare occasion. I think more often it would be about working with them on, do they want to tell their parents? Do they want you to tell their parents? And kind of working through how to involve their parents. Because there are a lot of, I mean, we don't know it, but something like 40%, I believe, of students would go to their parents and do feel their parents are supportive, and that their parents would be understanding, or their mother or their father. Like, it might not even be both parents, it might be one parent.
Okay, thanks. I think that's it. I see no other questions in the chat. So I'm going to say thank you so much to everybody for attending. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn more about this issue and wish you well in your work. I'd also like to remind you that Stacey's about to put in the link for the evaluation in the chat, and we encourage you to please complete that so that we can ensure that we are strong moving forward. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you, Joe, for your interesting insights and your thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next PREVNet webinar. Take care, everybody, and stay safe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.